All right, I think we got to this yesterday. I think we got to the point where we started talking about the sort of flaws in the Articles of Confederation, but every other class stopped at this point, so we got like 2 slides that we'll just go through a second time. Hopefully it'll help you. You really should understand the flaws of the Articles of Confederation in order to understand how we got to the Constitution, right? So with the Articles of Confederation, it was a relatively flawed document. Again, I think I told you that you had to, in order to accomplish anything or to change anything, you had to get all 13 states to agree. You'll never ever get 13 people to agree on the same thing, like ever. All right, it just doesn't happen. So the threshold for change was ultimately impossible to begin with, which is part of the reason why when we had the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they didn't try to change the Articles of Confederation. They simply threw it out and started all over again. Theoretically, they could have tried to amend the Articles, right? So some of those flaws, there's no one in charge, right? There's no chief executive or president. There's no national court system. There's no national currency. All of this leads to situations in which the states are pretty much completely autonomous. They have to regulate themselves. And then when there's some sort of conflict between 2 states, there's really no way to resolve it because there's no national government that's able to step in and sort of play mediator there. All right, all of this comes to a head with Shays' Rebellion. And I think we talked about this too, right? So we had a bunch of farmers that rose up and rebelled because they were going to have their property seized after having fought in the Revolutionary War in order to have life, liberty, and property. Now all of a sudden the government, the state government's going to come and try to seize their property. They rebel. There's actually no way to put the rebellion down. The Articles of Confederation did not allow for a standing army, so then when it happened, there's no one to stop said rebellion, which ultimately led to Washington sort of reconvening the Continental Army and then going up and stopping it. So all of this leads to this idea of the Constitution or the Constitutional Convention, which ultimately leads to the idea of the Constitution. When you look at the individuals that participate in it, it shouldn't surprise anybody that they're basically rich old white dudes. Okay? Rich old white dudes would have been the ones with the opportunity to travel and go to Philadelphia and actually participate in this because they didn't have to worry about any one of a number of things that your average individual has to deal with on a daily basis. All right? You don't really need to know all of the actual founding fathers. You should probably understand Madison is considered the father of the Constitution. He is the author of the majority of the Constitution. Washington, because he is so well revered amongst Americans, or amongst, well, I guess we'll call them Americans at this time. They're starting to become Americans. He's ultimately the one that is chosen to preside over the Continental Congress and maintain order and structure. All right. Alexander Hamilton is one that you should understand or you should know. He's a little bit more forceful. He's the guy that ultimately gets shot in a duel. But he is essentially the sort of the father of American currency. In fact, he's the guy that shows up on the $10 bill, and he was never president of the United States, but he's the one that creates our national currency, our national banking system. He's the one that advocated for a federal bank, even though it's nowhere in the Constitution, and it does happen on multiple occasions. Understand, and this is something that you'll get into from time to time with the idea of revisionist history. Do you know what that concept means, revisionist history? So revisionist history is this idea that all of a sudden we're going to change how we think or feel about things in order to determine or create some new interpretation of events. All right, and so when you look, we came up with this in 1913, this idea that basically there was some sort of conspiracy or some sort of systematic attempt to disenfranchise and limit the voice of people that were basically not rich old Protestant whites. It's a gross oversimplification. The truth of the matter is that for 200 plus years in this country's history, the primary goal of everyone was to own property. Okay? Millennials really seem to be the first generation that don't have that interest. They don't want to own a home. They want to rent. All right? But the aspect that, the fact that you would have to own property in order to be able to vote, right? That's not some sort of conspiracy to keep poor people out of the polls, but rather that's simply an assumption of everybody wants to own property. It's going to end up being a sort of common trait, okay? Especially when you consider at the time there's a vast amount of like unclaimed land, and obviously unclaimed we mean white people hadn't claimed it, okay? Now, when you actually get to the convention itself, there are some areas of agreement, right? We all decide we're going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation because they do not work, all right? We want to establish a Republican government. We talked about that before, the idea or the difference between Republicanism and democracy, right? Or a Republican democracy. We don't want a true democracy. Okay? We establish a constitutional government, which means that the Constitution, that founding document, is going to be the supreme law of the land, and it's going to be what dictates how we interact, behave, how we function as a country. All right? I told you yesterday, and I told you that we'll talk about it over and over and over again. We have a fear of tyranny in this country, so we want to establish a balanced government where there's not a consolidation of power in any single interest. And when I say interest, I mean Congress or the judiciary or the president. So an interest does not necessarily have to be a single individual. That goes back to that concept we talked about yesterday, oligarchy, right? So you could have 5 or 10 or 20 people that wield all of the power and then dominate basically the remainder of the country. We don't want that, so we're going to try to establish a balanced government through a system of checks and balances, separation of powers. All right? Again, suffrage is for property owners only at the time. We create a stronger national government because the Articles of Confederation didn't have one. And then we're going to protect property rights because that's ultimately the primary purpose of government. The primary purpose of government is to protect those basic rights that you have. Life, liberty, property. All right? When you look at representation among the states, okay, this is where we get into some of these areas of disagreement. Understand that, and it's kind of comical because it's the opposite of today, right? So when you look at the United States today, there's a massive, massive urban population center that basically runs from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C. Okay? You can literally sit in traffic that entire time trying to go through there from big city to big city to big city. During the Constitutional Convention times, right? So in the late 1700s, because obviously it's much, much colder up here. You cannot be as self-sufficient. You cannot grow as much crops or as much food. There are far fewer people that live here than in our southern states. So our southern states actually dominate the population. All right? What this leads to is an issue of how are we going to have our representative government, right? So if our government is going to be a republic and people are going to represent us, then how do we figure out how to do that? Virginia wants it to be based on population because Virginia has the population. New Jersey wants it to be based on state because they don't have the population. They want it to be equitable, right? You should have learned about this in APUSH, right? Virginia plan, big state plan. This is basically what you see in the House of Representatives. Jersey plan is small state plan. This is basically the Senate. Everybody's equal, all right? Ultimately, what you're going to get out of this is the Connecticut Compromise. So we have a bicameral legislature. Bicameralism is a term you need to know. That's something that you need to understand, right? So bicameralism, bi simply means two. Cameral refers to houses or chambers, actually, is technically what it refers to, right? So there are two chambers of our legislature, all right? One based on population, one based on equality. All right, next, you probably learned about the Three-Fifths Compromise in school in U.S. history or somewhere at some point in time. So this is kind of a funny thing. The northern states want slaves to count for the purposes of taxing, but not for the purposes of, like, voting. Southern states want them to count for the purposes of voting and representation, but not for the purposes of taxes. All right? Both sides, and we tend to give the South a little bit more grief today, especially because we recognize just how terrible slavery is in U.S. history. So we tend to give the South a little bit of a harder time, but understand that the North is almost as unreasonable as the South is in this regard, because they really want to manipulate this in order to try to make more money from the southern states because of slavery, which is ultimately how you're going to end up with the Three-Fifths Compromise. All right? So basically, black people count as 3/5 of a person. Okay? Election of the president is the next thing that we have to compromise on, and we'll go over this in a little bit more detail when we go over the unit and the PowerPoint on the president specifically. But there were all manner of sort of ideas as to how to elect a national executive, ultimately called the president now. Some people wanted that to happen annually. Some people wanted it to happen like once. Like you elect somebody, they're president for life. Then when they die, you elect another person. So you understand, if that were the case, okay, if that were the case, the president of the United States would currently be a man named Jimmy Carter, because he's the oldest living former president. Well, he's not the oldest living former president. He's the most senior of living presidents. He was elected first of all living presidents. Maybe that's the easiest way to say it. And what that means is this man was elected in 1976. Okay, so in my entire 30-plus year lifetime, I would have one president, and that would be Jimmy Carter, who was a really, really great man, but he was not a good president at all. All right. Method of election, we have to compromise on that as well, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get into our unit on elections specifically. But ultimately, we're going to end up with this compromise of the electoral college system. All right, we don't really want direct elections, again, because direct elections are going to benefit or are going to be monopolized by the large states, right? So if you have a direct election, then in all honesty, in the United States today, all you would have to do is win California, New York, Florida, and Texas, and you would win. If you got all the votes from those 4 states, you would be the next president of the United States. And that means that you could disregard the wants and wishes and desires of 46 other states, which is probably not fair, and it's certainly something that the northern states did not want at this point, which is part of the reason why we end up with the Electoral College Compromise. Now, inevitably, one of the things that happens is we begin to go through all of this, we're going to automatically start dividing ourselves into factions. And you will have to read a couple of the Federalist Papers throughout the course of the semester. One of them is written by James Madison, and it's this idea of factions, or how we group ourselves. This is a natural occurrence within our society. We tend to group ourselves. We do this politically almost from the beginning of our sort of constitutional democracy. So we're going to end up with 2 groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. When you look at the Federalists, most of the Federalist supporters are a little bit more of your well-to-do people. They're a little bit higher class. And so they want that stronger government because they need a government that's going to be able to have authority and power in order to protect their economic interests. All right? So they don't want excessive democracy because these are already sort of the haves. And hopefully you understand in society that the have-nots will always outnumber the haves. Okay? So if you are a person of wealth, of means, you don't necessarily want equity or true democracy because you don't want all of the have-nots to have as much say as you do, or else you will ultimately lose what you had. All right? So that's the basic concept here of the Federalists. They want that stronger central government. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, are your, what we would refer to today as working class people or blue-collar people. I don't want to call them lower class because they're not. They're just simply not as wealthy. They operate differently. Okay, so these would be like small farmers, frontiersmen, people that are not of means. Okay, they're sort of self-sufficient, self-made. They're very fearful of a strong national government, and they already kind of have this idea, this understanding that a strong national government is going to be dominated by economic elites anyways. And so they don't want too much power in the hands of that group that's going to dominate them economically, because ultimately these people at times are going to have to rely on economic elites in order to accomplish sort of life, right? Whether they need to take out a loan because they've had a bad harvest or whatever, all right? They have to go to those haves occasionally with their hand out. They don't want those haves having too much power. We get that concept? They're not saying that government doesn't need to exist, but rather that government should be more powerful at a local or state level rather than a national level. All right. And then additionally, they fear that the more power that you give to the national government, the more likely you are to lose sort of basic individual rights. In fact, the Bill of Rights itself becomes a significant compromise in assuaging the fears of the anti-federalists. So that way we know here we have these 10 sort of amendments that dictate what the national government can't do to you, right? It can't take these different things from you. Ironically, there were some Federalists, and Madison was one of them, who was opposed to the Bill of Rights, not because he didn't think that basic humans should have rights or that Americans should have basic rights, but rather he was fearful that if we started listing them, you would inevitably forget things. You would forget to put something on the list that was essential, and then because you created said list, it would afford the government the opportunity to steal that from you, essentially. All right? The Federalists are obviously ultimately successful. We have a constitution, and they're successful for a couple of reasons. One, they're much better organized, and because they're the elites, they control the press. All right, this is how we get the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are, this is where it sucks to be dyslexic, either 78 or 87 different essays, for lack of a better word. They're basically essays, editorials, if you would. All right, that basically dictate a wide variety of topics that talk about why the Constitution is essential and sort of what American politics should be moving forward. All right, they're going to go ahead and start the ratification process really before the Anti-Federalists can even organize. Again, because the Federalists were better organized. They're also a little bit better represented in the state legislature, again, because these people are a little bit more of the elites of society. All right. And then in order to actually ultimately accomplish this, the Federalists are going to agree to the Bill of Rights after ratification occurs. All right? Yeah, that's just the Federalist Papers. So, when we look at some provisions then of the actual Constitution, all right, we know, we said yesterday, and I told you I'll tell you over and over and over again, tyranny is our biggest fear. Okay, so we're going to create 3 branches. This comes from Montesquieu, which is one of those 3 philosophers that I told you that you needed to know. Right? We create 3 sort of independent, unique branches of government. You should have learned probably in 5th grade or 6th grade or whatever, right, that those 3 branches all have different responsibilities when it comes to law, right? Congress does what? What's the verb? What? Make. Thank you, whoever said that. Make. Congress makes laws, right? What does the executive do? Carry them out. Enforce would be the word I would use, just to get it down to one word. Okay? So the executive, yeah, they carry out the laws, they enforce the laws, they execute the laws, whichever word you want to use. What does the judicial do? What? Interpret. Thank you. Okay? So the judicial interprets said laws. All right? So we're going to divide those powers amongst those 3 to ensure that no one monopolizes that power. And then ultimately, in the division of power, we also create a system of checks and balances that is inherently going to work. Because if we create a law, right, that is unfair or unjust, somebody can interpret it as such and then say that it's no good, that it's not a fair or valid law. All right? So these are sort of Montesquieu's ideologies, some of the things that he believes in that end up showing up in the Constitution. Obviously, we don't abolish slavery due solely to the fact that the southern states had the numbers at that time. It wasn't going to happen. All right? But we do have a Constitution that preserves civil liberties and does create rule of law. Rule of law is a concept you should understand. It basically means that everyone is subject to the same laws. That's what's supposed to happen. All right? You can argue that that doesn't happen anymore today. But theoretically, police officers are not allowed to speed either. If I can get a ticket for speeding, then so should a police officer. All right? right, so this brings us to checks and balances. All right, and so this, again, inherently comes out of the separation of powers. You can't really have checks and balances unless you have separated your powers, because you need at least semi-equal power in order to check the things that are being done in any given branch. All right. Again, this reflects the fear of tyranny. We'll just give you a handful of examples here. The President of the United States can veto any piece of legislation passed by Congress. That is a constitutional provision, right? Meaning it is actually in the Constitution. It's not interpreted, it is specified. The President can veto anything that he wants. Congress can override that veto. Meaning that if Congress is certain, beyond a doubt, that this is an absolutely essential piece of legislation and the President vetoes it, so long as 2/3 of Congress is in agreement, they can override a presidential veto. It doesn't happen very often because you need 2/3 majority. In fact, I only know of one instance in which Obama was overridden. Despite the fact that he spent a significant amount of time working with a Republican Congress. So he vetoed a fair number of Republican initiatives that the Republicans still couldn't override that veto. Other aspects here, treaties. So the President of the United States or the executive branch, they engage in treaties. We'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about the President. You'll understand why it has to be the President that deals with foreign countries. But the President can't make a treaty that Congress doesn't agree to. The Senate has to ratify it. The best example that I can really give you of this is you should have learned in U.S. history at some point in time about Woodrow Wilson, right? You know, Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I, and at the end of World War I, he came up with this idea, right? Actually, multiple ideas, called it his 14 points, one of which was establishing the League of Nations. Did the United States join the League of Nations? No. Right? Our president came up with the idea in order to try to stop any sort of like global conflict from ever happening again, and yet we don't even join the organization that we thought up because the Senate doesn't allow it. Alright? There's a staggering of terms within each branch, again, so that you can't get wholesale changes in government as a result of sort of massive shifts in political ideology throughout the population. Alright, so just so you understand, we know that the President has 4-year terms, right? House of Representatives has 2-year terms, the Senate has 6-year terms, judges have lifetime terms, right? So there's a stagger of all of that. When you look at 2018, for instance, is what we call the midterm election, and we'll talk about that again in more detail when we get to the elections unit. But 1/3 of the Senate will be up for re-election because they're up for re-election every 6 years. So every 2 years, 1/3 comes up for re-election. All right. Political parties initially are actually thought of as being detrimental to our system of separation of powers and checks and balances. Because theoretically, the founders sort of looked at political parties. Well, one, they saw political parties as being a negative. All right, there's no doubt about that. Political parties are not beneficial to the welfare and the democracy of this country. But there's an essential amount of fear in the late 1700s that political parties are ultimately going to be able to consolidate power. And even though we have separated power amongst 3 different branches and we have opportunities for those different government entities to check one another, if you end up in a situation like we are in today, where you have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican President, and for the most part, a Republican Supreme Court, then theoretically, right, all of those checks and balances go out the window because the consolidation of all that power within one political party is going to weaken checks and balances, right? And that's the initial fear. In all honesty, it doesn't play out that way, and it doesn't play out that way for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think, and this is just speculation on my part, I don't think the Founding Fathers understood that the way they set up our government created the inevitability of 2 political parties, and that's it. We will only ever have two political parties in this country. That is it. Okay? Right now it's the Republicans and the Democrats. I'm not saying it will always be the Republicans and the Democrats. Sometimes that changes. But there will only ever be two real parties in this country. So when you turn 18 and you go to vote for president for the first time, okay, if you want to go vote Green Party and Jill Stein last year, or you want to go and vote Gary Johnson in the Libertarian Party, or you want to just write in Mickey Mouse or whatever, you're wasting your vote. Those people cannot win. They will never, ever win under any circumstance. I can't say never, because you never know. But they're not real parties. And they're real parties, but they can't win. All right? The system is set up, and I'll show you later on in the semester how we get to that point, why the way our system is the way that it is, why we will only ever have two political parties. But what happens when you whittle it down to two political parties, then in order to try to appease enough of the population to get them to join your party becomes so watered down, it believes in so many different things, that even within the party, there are massive sort of rifts. That people aren't always on the same page. A really good example that I can give you is, and we'll get into this when we get into stereotyping as well. Stereotypically, Catholics are Democrats. Stereotypically. Okay? Democrats believe that abortion should be legal. Catholics do not. Yet Catholics are Democrats. Right? So you see in that instance how within a single individual party, you can have people from those parties that disagree with one another. And that's what really prevents that sort of political dominance from bringing this whole system sort of crashing down to where one party controls everything and then we do have tyranny. All right? What we've ended up with over the last 40 to 50 years now, we're actually in what we call a system or an era of divided government, okay, in which we typically see the President of the United States being a member of one party and the Congress being a member of another party. Right? Obviously, this happened with Barack Obama. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, I wholeheartedly believe that in November, Democrats will win overwhelmingly, and next January, Donald Trump will deal with a Democratic Congress. Right? Then we'll go right back to that era of divided government. Okay? Some changes in the checks and balances. Senators are now chosen by the people. That is the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay? Senators used to be appointed by state legislatures. Okay? Congressmen are chosen by the people. Electors choose the president. So again, a little bit of a check, and that's a check on the individual public, right? In fact, the fact that we appointed senators from state legislature rather than electing senators, that was again a check on the people. And we'll talk about that when we get to Congress, and you'll understand that the representatives and the senators have different responsibilities, and they were set up to be different. All right? We lump them all together as Congress all the time, but that's not really how it's supposed to work. All right? Additionally, we have the growth of the bureaucracy. It's a modification to our checks and balances system. This is actually something that weakens our checks and balances. Again, we'll get to this in more detail when we get to the bureaucracy unit. But basically, I'm kind of a fan of Max. Do you remember the Max Weber thing yesterday about the bureaucracy wielding all the power? I kind of believe that that's ultimately how it works now. Okay? Yes, the economic elites do wield a significant amount of power, and so therefore maybe it's C. Mills Wright, or C. Wright Mills, who's actually correct. But the bureaucracy wields a significant amount of power. The bureaucracy was not something that was really conceived of by the Founding Fathers. They didn't, in all honesty, they didn't even really see sort of politician as a career. Okay? Now, politician, that's an actual career path. Like, you go to school and you're like, what do you want to be in life? I want to be a politician. Right? It used to be, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a farmer, like whatever. And then maybe because you are attentive and you pay attention and you follow politics, you go, hey, I think I can make a difference, I'm going to go run. I'm going to serve in Congress for 4 years or 6 years or 8 years or whatever, and then I'm going to go back home, and I'm going to go back to my old life and my real job, right? Nowadays, you get people like Ted Cruz, whose sole purpose in life is to be a politician, right? Like, if Ted Cruz actually became president of the United States, because he's relatively young, I don't know what he would do with the rest of his life afterwards. Same with Obama. Like, I'm not sure what that man is going to do. There are actually speculations that that man is going to become a Supreme Court justice, because he is too young to retire, to do nothing, right? But, yeah, he taught law for like 2 years. That's not a real career. I mean, it is a real career, but it wasn't a career for him. It was a stopping point, right? But the bureaucracy changes that, because the bureaucracy wields a significant amount of power, and they have usurped or taken some power from other entities. Okay? Technological advances. So there are times where technology has helped with our system of checks and balances. There's actually times where it's weakened our system of checks and balances as well. All right, so some examples that I can give you is when you look at sort of the internet or whitehouse.gov, which is a petition website where you can actually go and petition the government to do things. That serves as an opportunity for the people to be checking what's going on at a national level, right? The fact that we have television, satellites, and constant media coverage, that serves as a check on presidential authority or congressional authority or their actions, right? On the other hand, there's times where those technological advancements actually hinder checks and balances. And I'll tell you this multiple times throughout the semester, and my kids and my students never seem to care. It drives me crazy that you don't care. But you understand that the government listens to all your phone calls and reads all your text messages. Like, you know this, right? If you don't, just go ahead and nod your head yes now. I am telling you, the government reads all your emails, all your text messages, they listen to your phone calls. So if you are doing something with that little cell phone that you shouldn't be doing, just understand that the government has it. Like, they know. And if 20 years from now you decide you want to run for the Senate, yeah. But Americans don't seem to care, right? Which is one of those instances where the government is utilizing technology and really hindering checks and balances because we just let them spy on us. We let them violate our Fourth Amendment rights because we don't really care. Other issues where checks and balances sort of change or hinder. We become a superpower following World War II. Basically, the United States is now ultimately in charge of the world. No, there's like 8 minutes left. Can you wait 8 minutes? Okay. So the U.S. is ultimately sort of in charge. It's a bad way of saying it. In charge of the world. All right. But this limits or hinders checks and balances because now we operate on a global level that we were never really intended to operate on based on the original Constitution. And so there's really not a lot of ways to check the executive and the presidential authority and how they're dealing with all of that. All right? Now, the issue here, excuse me, the issue with all of this, the reason for checks and balances, the reason for separation of power, I told you a second ago, the reason that we do so much of what we do when we create the Constitution initially is because we are fearful of tyranny. We can't have the Articles of Confederation. We can't have a system in place where there are no protections for a national government or for the people. But we also don't want some sort of tyrannical government that's going to come and take our rights. Okay? So when we create a constitutional government, theoretically, and I know I mentioned this to you yesterday, the national government is only supposed to do the small number of jobs that are actually listed in the Constitution. Okay? That provides the government with its powers, and those are the powers that it should wield. And the Bill of Rights operates as a safeguard to protect us against tyrannical government, to ensure that the government is not stepping on our individual fundamental rights. And so again, this is a part of that balancing act of how we're going to create a government strong enough to be able to protect us, to protect our property, to protect our welfare, yet not so strong that it can trample upon us. All right? And then ultimately, in all of this, we need to make sure that we have free and fair elections, because that is our way of us as a people operating in that system of checks and balances. When the government begins to do things that are detrimental to our welfare, we can turn around and stop them, right? And by stopping them, I mean voting them out of office. All right? I was actually wrong. The bell rings in now, so go ahead and pack up.
That's on campus, right?
Yes, ma'am.